On this special edition of Independent Sources, Homeless NYC, concerns that more people are sleeping on the streets in the city and what is being done to address that. Our special look coming up on Independent Sources. Welcome to Independent Sources, bringing you news from New York's ethnic and immigrant communities. I'm Zyphus Lebrun. Walking the streets of New York these days, and it's hard not to see them, men and women swaddled in layers of clothing or huddled together for warmth in the shadow of a building. They are the drawn faces of the city's homeless. One statistic from the Coalition for the Homeless estimates that there are nearly 60,000 people sleeping in municipal shelters each night. There are those who believe that's only the tip of the proverbial iceberg. So, are the numbers increasing, or aren't they? With me in studio to answer these and other questions are Jeff Foreman, the Director of Policy at New York City Care for the Homeless, and Mira Garrett Bayonne, co-founder and broker at Skyton Group. Skyton Group is a boutique brokerage firm that works with the city to provide affordable housing units to homeless clients. Thank you both for joining us in studio today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, awesome. All right, before we start, I'd just like us to take a look at this piece produced by Abby Shola.
Have you noticed more homeless people in New York City?
No, it's not that I noticed that more people, just they are not being, I guess, reached out to, and as a result, they're still there. And they are there for a long time. And it's the funny thing is I believe the Department of Homeless maybe or individuals should be reaching out to them, but I don't see them.
So have you noticed more homeless people in the city?
Recently I did, yeah.
Have you noticed more homeless people around the city?
I have. Like in the subways, actually on the streets as well. I just gave someone $1 on Fifth Avenue just now, so yeah.
How does it make you feel?
Scared. I mean, it's like a sign of the times, and it can be anybody, it could be me, it could be you. So yeah, it's a scary thing, scary.
They're all populated in certain areas where it's warm, like over the grates, and they camp out there for a while. Or I live near a bridge, it's under the bridge. So, yeah.
How does it make you feel?
A little uncomfortable. I mean, I also feel really bad and wish that they would just find a place to go. But what are you going to do? People choose to live that way.
Or do you think that the city is doing enough to help homeless people?
I don't know. I think that some people choose to live that way.
Do you think the city is doing a good enough job with letting people know what they can do?
I cannot really comment on that because I myself is a city employee and we try our best, but a lot of times is that there's so many different arms attached to it, you just don't know who's supposed to be reaching out to.
I'm a small business owner, and to some degree I do feel it. When there's a lot of homelessness around my business, you feel that people are afraid. But personally, no, I don't think it's affect me.
Okay. What kind of business?
I have those shops at the holiday market.
So when homeless people are around, sometimes it makes other people not feel comfortable?
Correct. It's most of businesses rely on tourists, and they're kind of scary. At the end of the day, homeless is a human being. You don't want to hurt anyone, but people out of New York are afraid of it.
What about for the crime rate? Does it make you feel like it'll go up?
No, I'm not so worried about that. People have needs, so when you're homeless, like your concern is shelter, security, a place to lay down without feeling like compromised. And in the streets, it's just not safe. So,
do you think the city is doing enough?
I really don't know what the city can do. I did hear about de Blasio pushing with a homeless shelter, trying to get a lot of people off the streets. And I did hear about the police, I guess going in the subways, getting the homeless people out of the tunnels and stuff like that. But I mean, if you don't have any place to go, that's hard, man. I don't know.
They can go to homeless shelters, and I've talked to people before, and they're like, I'm like, what are you doing? They're like, I have family. Like, people have family. They just, maybe I don't know. I don't really know many homeless people, so.
All right, a lot of varying views there, a lot of intriguing views there. First question to you, Jeff, is, are the numbers increasing?
I think that's an interesting question. We have very exact figures for people who are in the various shelter systems. and they are precise day by day. So we know that there are, in fact, increasing numbers in the shelter system. The real question, I think, is people who are not in the system, street homeless people, and there's an annual on-the-street count, but that's a very difficult thing to do. People question the accuracy. There are, however, a few ways, I think there are two important ways to look at that question. First, there are some evidence-based statistics, for example, calls to the 311 line about people who are homeless, people who use drop-in centers or safe havens, which are typically for people who are homeless and on the street. Those measures are way up, which would lead you to believe that there are more homeless people living on the streets. I think the second important way is New Yorkers anecdotally see more people on the street. So I do feel there are more homeless people. And in the various systems, the fact that it's up so high would also lead you to believe that.
Mm-hmm. Now the thing too is that, just to clarify, and you say the various systems, you're talking about on one level there's what the city is doing, and then there are grassroots organizations and nonprofits that are also trying to address this, correct?
Well, I'm actually talking about something more specific than that. The number that people use, that you see in the media all the time, is the number of people that live in the City Department of Homeless Services homeless shelters. Early in December, that number went over 58,000 for the first time in many, many months, and it has been going up. That's the number that always gets used. When you see a story in the paper, when you see coverage on television, typically they will cite that number as the number of people who are homeless. But there are other homeless shelter systems that are run by the City of New York. They just aren't run as Department of Homeless Service shelters. For example, we have a large domestic violence shelter program. Those people are also homeless. In fact, that's a time-limited program. When you hit the end of your time there, most of the victims who are in domestic violence shelters have a choice: go back to their abuser or go to a homeless shelter. There are 8,880 beds in the domestic violence shelter system. There's a separate system under the HIV/AIDS Services Administration that has an emergency and a transitional program for housing for people who have HIV/AIDS. Those two categories, emergency and transitional, not counting their permanent housing, that's over 3,000 beds.
Oh, wow.
We have a separate system for beds for runaway and homeless unaccompanied youth. There's 350 beds in that system. So when we say 58,000, that's really, if you count the other systems, we're well over maybe 65,000 or
Right.
more. And that doesn't get to the street homeless people or the nonprofit, usually church-based shelters.
All right. So Mira, in your experience, what's contributing to this increase in numbers that we're seeing?
Well, it's multifaceted. There's a few different components to it. First of all, I would point out that New York City is unique in that it is a right to shelter city. So stemming back from the legal precedent from 1979 of Callahan versus Carey, where basically it stated that per New York State Constitution that it is the city's and the state's duty to have housing for these people in emergency situations where they have nowhere to go. So if you have nowhere to go in a city, you have the right basically to go into any intake center, and they must provide you by law with housing that same night. Now with that said, there are a lot of migrants coming into New York City who know that if I have no place to go, I can go there. So you have a lot of people who are in the homeless shelters who are not from New York City, right, but they know that they can come and it's a safe haven. So that's increasing the numbers, particularly in this economic climate.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, after Superstorm Sandy, a lot of New Yorkers were displaced. Their homes were damaged or destroyed, and some of them in turn went to live with family, and then as the economy continued to tank, now your family is in financial trouble, and now you need to leave, or you have nowhere to go. Mm-hmm. So there are a multitude of reasons why.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned this whole right to shelter because New York City falls under the category. One of the women in the piece talked about this notion that, hey, listen, that people who are homeless essentially choose to be homeless. I mean, is there any credence to that, or is she like way off base?
No, I think there is some truth to that. Again, there are a lot of components to homelessness, and you have a lot of mental health issues, substance abuse. So clearly, you know, if you have some mental health issues that cloud your judgment and logical choices, you may end up on the street. Or a lot of people end up on the street because they say they don't feel safe in the homeless shelters. There's a lot of, you know, moving parts to that. So in essence, there are some people on the street who do choose to be on the street because per that right, they could have shelter.
Right, if they chose to.
If they chose to.
Okay. Now, you mentioned something, Mira, and I want to pick this up with you, Jeff, is this notion of folks do not feel safe in the shelters. Is that something that's pervasive? Is that something that's kind of like one-off? Have you heard anything of that?
I think there are a lot of people who do not feel safe in the shelter system, and to be honest, there's a wide variety of types of shelters and conditions and qualities in shelters. So there are some very good shelters in the city, and I think most people who are in those shelters would feel relatively safe. I've never met anyone who wanted to live in shelter. I always refer to that as breaking into shelter. Nobody wants to break into a shelter. They're all trying to get out, but some are safe. There are some shelters that really aren't very safe, and I can understand why people would be very uncomfortable and even feel unsafe in them.
Okay.
And there are some shelters they're very comfortable. We've heard of a few where, you know, they even do your laundry.
Wow.
Where some people aren't really, because, you know, we deal with people and trying to get them out of the shelters, and we found suitable housing for many people who've turned it down, believe it or not.
Really?
Yeah.
And why was that? Did they give you a reason?
Well, a lot of people say that, oh, it's too far away. You know, they wanted to be in particular areas. Now that they have a voucher, I guess they're thinking, well, it's my, you know, I can start over and I want to be in a particular place, or, you know, they're kind of comfortable where they are. You know, you don't have to worry. There's a lot of things you don't have to worry about when you're in the shelter. You know that you have a place to stay. You don't have to worry about rent. You don't have to worry about a lot of things. Now, coming out of that, I think there's a transition of, okay, now, yes, I want to be integrated back into typical everyday independent society, but now I'm on my own. You know, there's not that support system. You know, you have your caseworkers and things like that when you're in the shelter. Now you're on your own. A lot of people, that is a transition. That can be scary.
All right, we'll stick a pin in here, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about what's being done to help alleviate some of this homelessness in the city. Before that, Crystal Lowe has some other news.
Here's a look at some headlines from New York's ethnic and community media. Brooklyn-based reports on Refugees Welcome, a storefront sticker campaign created in response to the Syrian refugee crisis. The premise is simple. The organization creates stickers intended for display in storefront windows and doors that make it clear that refugees are welcome at that place of business. The idea for the project was launched by a strategist, activist, and Bosnian refugee, Vida Partalo. She teamed up with the business owners of a Minneapolis creative studio called Burlesque of North America to create the transparent Refugees Welcome stickers, which can now be purchased by visiting their website at burlesquedesign.com. 6 South Bronx natives have come together to create an exhibit titled Barrios, capturing over 3 decades of images featuring the Bronx in its raw form. The Hunts Point Express takes a closer look at these 6 photographers who collectively call themselves Seis del Sur. They all started taking pictures of the South Bronx in their teens, with most of the images being shot during the early 1980s. Now professional photographers and filmmakers, they describe the 2-floor exhibit as their story, documenting their personal lives while chronicling the borough's rebound from despair and neglect. Barrios is running now through March 16th at New York University. In other news, New York's Indian Jews strive to preserve their heritage. News India Times reports on Baghdadis and the Bene Israel in Bollywood and beyond, an exhibit that explores the largely forgotten history of the Bene Israel of India. The exhibit, comprised of books and memorabilia from the Kenneth and Joyce Robbins collection, explores how Indian Jews, women in particular, were leaders in Bollywood and beyond at a time when customs and traditions kept them out. The exhibit will be on display at the Center for Jewish History in New York City until April 1st. And finally, the Museum of the City of New York helped celebrate folk singer Dolores D. Dixon and others in an exhibit titled Folk City, New York and the Folk Music Revival. The Riverdale Press reports the exhibit will follow the rise of folk music in New York City and its influence on American society in the 1950s and 60s. Dixon, the sole female member of the New World Singers, along with her bandmates, recorded one of the earliest versions of the protest song made famous by Bob Dylan called "Blowin' in the Wind." She, along with other civil rights era folk music artists, all made music in the name of social change. The multimedia exhibition, featuring original instruments, handwritten lyrics, video, and film footage, will be on display at the Museum of the City of New York until January 10th, 2016. Those are just a few headlines from the city's ethnic and community media. Independent sources will be right back.
Thanks for staying tuned to our special look at homelessness in the city. Mira, before we went to break, we were talking about, people not necessarily kind of liking the system because they have support. What I wanted to talk about now is kind of what's in place on the city level, I guess, for assisting people. For instance, I know that there is a LINK program that you're involved with. Could you talk a little bit about that program?
Sure. The LINK program is relatively new. It is a government aid system where they're giving people in shelters vouchers to find private housing. Now that could be rooms or apartments, standard apartments, and they're paying basically for either a portion or for the whole month's rent throughout the lease to get these people out of the shelters. We're working with the caseworkers directly from these homeless shelters and with the Department of Homeless Services to basically facilitate getting the demand and the supply. Mm-hmm. And we are kind of running into some walls with landlords just not really knowing much about the program or having false perceptions of who this market is coming into.
And when you say false perceptions, you mean?
When you think homeless, people coming from a homeless shelter, a lot of people think, oh, it must be, mental health issues or substance abuse, or just people who don't want to do anything for themselves, which is not the case. We have most of the people that we work with are working, have some savings, and are trying to get themselves back out there and integrated back into private sector living.
Now, are there incentives for the landlords when they allow folks to come in and use their homes?
Yes, there are incentives. First of all, you're able to rent rooms. So we found with a lot of our landlords that we've worked with, we're able to get them hundreds of dollars more over what they were asking just on the private rental market, because you're able to now break your apartment. If you have a 3-bedroom apartment, you can break it up into 3 rooms and rent them out $800 per room. Mm-hmm. Now, for apartments, studio, 1-bedroom, there's $1,000 bonus, signing bonus. And if you bring in a veteran, there's up to $2,500 in bonus money.
So the city's making it look good for these landlords.
They're trying to give incentives so that you would at least give it a chance.
Right.
Have the conversation, meet some of these people,
Right, absolutely. Now, Jeff, do you find that that there are a lot of programs like this in the city that people just don't know about?
I think that's true. People don't know about the LINK program. There are actually 6 separate LINK programs for different categories, and they have 2 additional rental assistance programs, one based on a federal program to avoid evictions, and another one a tenant-based program. And in all those programs, the tenants pay 30% of their gross income towards the rent. So it's affordable. That's a HUD definition of affordable for affordable housing.
Right.
It's affordable to the tenant, many of whom are either in very low wage jobs, usually minimum wage jobs, or maybe on some form of government benefit like a Social Security disability income. But whatever their income is, they pay 30% of it, and then the city would pick up the rest to the limitation. So there are those programs, and there's a lot of other things the city does. For example, I think it's really important that the city has increased their aid for prevention programs that will help people who are at risk of homelessness. And in the first year of the new administration, they doubled that the amount for that program, and then they added 50% more the second year. And that seems to be working to avoid evictions and prevent people from losing housing, and that's important too.
Right.
Definitely.
But one of the things, though, is that, the mayor's been criticized a lot. He's been criticized very sharply because a lot of folks feel that he's not doing enough. Is that an accurate description of him not handling the homeless situation?
Well, as an advocate for homeless policies, we would always like to see them do more. I think that the two things that are most concerning about city policies are, number one, are they to the scale of the problem? And number two, are they fast enough? So, for example, one of the greatest things that the city can do is to create supportive housing. The city just announced a program to create 15,000 units of supportive housing. That would be a remarkable increase, but it's over 15 years, and that's not really fast enough.
Right.
So, we would have some criticism for some of the policies. I think it's moving in the right direction. The real problem has been, and I think it goes to the problems that Link has been having, that there just aren't enough units available in that price range.
Yeah.
That's why the creation of new units like the supportive housing becomes so important.
Definitely.
And now there's a greater push towards that. I mean, is there any sense that, things may change? You were saying about the scale of it. Is there any sense that on the ground, at least from the government perspective, that they're heeding this call, that, hey, listen, we need to create those units?
In the current year budget, the city budgeted for over 8,000 vouchers. But I can tell you that there are thousands of people who are holding vouchers that can't find units. Wow. That's why it's so important, that people are helping them find units. But there just aren't enough units out there. So I think that's really the crux of the problem, and it's going to take a little while to deal with it. But that we've really got to do that. If we had continued to put as much money into public housing as we did in the 1960s and especially the 1970s, we probably wouldn't have that problem today.
Right.
But lots of studies have shown that we've lost a tremendous amount of units in the last decade or so for extremely low income or people living in deep poverty.
Mm-hmm. And why is that? I mean, I kind of know the answer to that, but
well, I think one of the ways to answer that is that we are sort of a victim of our own success. That is, we've had an incredible boom of building in New York City. Any New Yorker can see that. I can see it from my window every day. But those are mostly what most people would think of as luxury apartments. High-rise, glass enclosed places that are never going to be for the people that we represent. And the places that got knocked down to build them, in many cases, were years ago it was SROs, the single-room occupancy places where poor New Yorkers traditionally found housing, and in more recent years it was just low-income housing. But so there was a recent study that came out from Street Easy, the real estate website, that said we lost 400,000 units of $1,000 rent or less. Wow. There was a study that was done towards the end of the Bloomberg administration by the Community Services Society that said we had lost over 600,000 units that were affordable to people at 200% of poverty and lower. That's a big part of the answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we'll do for our second break, and when we come back, we'll get a couple of final thoughts from you. Welcome back. With me in studio are Jeff Foreman and Mira Garrett Bayonne. Thanks again for being with us. So I just wanted to kind of wrap up our conversation, which has been a really good one, with some final thoughts. And Mira, I'll let you go first. Just kind of a general sense of maybe what you think is next for addressing homelessness in the city,
Well, I think that the city is definitely making strides to rid the problem and to get it under control. Where I stand from what I do at Skyton Group, my husband and I every day, we are just trying really hard to help facilitate what's being put in place and just trying to ramp up the supply to meet the demand. So what I would really like is just for the landlords out there to just give it a shot. Let's have a conversation about it, see if it's mutually beneficial, and see where we can go with it, because there's a lot of incentives out there for helping, opening your eyes and helping with the homeless market.
Is there a way that perhaps these folks can get in touch with you, landlords or people who may be interested?
Sure, they could visit our website. There's tons of information there. www.skyton, S-K-Y-T-O-N, regroup.com.
All right, great. And Jeff, some final thoughts from you?
Well, there's two things I was thinking about. One is, I think it's important to note, and we haven't mentioned that it's against the law for landlords to discriminate against people because of the source of funding of their rent. So that's sort of a last alternative, but people should not discriminate based on where the rent money is coming from, and it is illegal to do so. The second thing I wanted to say is, as an advocate, I feel strongly and confident that we could end homelessness, and we could do it in the next several years if we committed ourselves to it. And I feel strongly that we could do that because we could do it for not more money than we're already spending. It's much cheaper to find housing for people than it is to spend over $1 billion a year in New York City for shelter. So I really would love to see us commit ourselves to solving this problem. And it's great for the victims of homelessness. It's great for our neighborhoods. It's the right thing to do. And it will actually save us money over time.
You mentioned the fact that folks should not be discriminated against. Do they have any kind of recourse if they do feel that they are discriminated against?
The Human Rights Commission is where they should go. They should file a complaint. As I said, it's sort of a last resort. What they really want is housing, not to get into an argument with the landlord.
Of course.
But that's what should happen. I know that many organizations, legal aid societies, and the Department of Homeless Services are aware that there's a lot of discrimination going on and are thinking about how to handle bringing cases.
Okay.
And part of it is proving it. Right. So if we brought more education to the landlords and give them, this is what it is, this is what it's not, then maybe they'll be more open and more open to the idea.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Mira, and thank you, Jeff. There's so much more that we could talk about, but I guess we just don't have the time right now. And that's all we have this week. I'd like to thank my guests once more, Jeff Foreman and Mira Garrett Bayonne, for coming in. On behalf of all the good folks here at Independent Sources, I'd like to wish you and your family happy holidays.